Hi, I'm Mike Henry, and this is my Procreate 4.3 demo for the piece I call Tifa, Lockhart. Every now and then you gotta keep these titles simple, know what I mean? So my favorite game of all time is Final Fantasy VII. It might not be my favorite series, meaning all the Final Fantasies, but as far as a single game goes, it's absolutely my favorite game. And of course, I'm super excited about the new remake that's coming out next year and then in subsequent years as they finish the other parts. Now, Tifa's a badass character, so I wanted to give her the proper tribute, but you're going to see this process was fraught with me just having no rock solid ideas. So the beginning of this video is going to be a ton of just me running through ideas and not really getting anything that I'm happy with. Also, this video is going to have some drop recording, so we're going to do a file deep dive like we did on the previous video. So I hope you're excited about that. So let's go ahead and start going through the messy process of me trying to figure out what this piece was going to be. From the beginning, I knew that I didn't want to do anything too stoic because that's kind of what I love doing in general. Action poses are awesome, but I, for whatever reason, just get really excited about more still moments. However, I wanted to portray Tifa as a badass because I think all too often she just gets drawn as like a pinup character, and that's fine every now and then, but that's really not her. So I wanted to try and get into the fact that she's the monk of the game and she's just an ass whooper. And so that was where I was at the beginning of trying to figure this out. So you can see here I'm blocking out examples of her like blocking an attack from a Shinra Soldier and she's about to punch them or some other thing. We're going to run through a lot of ideas here. You're going to see me scribbling and stopping and scribbling and stopping, and so I'll just try to talk through each individual one of these. So here's another one of those, another example of her maybe leaping into action or being in a fight pose of some sort. Really, I just was searching and I didn't have an idea at all. I literally was just like, I don't know what pose to put her in that's going to be exciting. So that's what all of this mess is of me in a Procreate file messing around. So you see there we go from a landscape file now to a portrait file as far as aspect ratio is concerned. And so now I'm going into a slightly different thing where I'm like, okay, well, what if I go for more of the stoic pose of like after the fight? So I had this idea of her sort of doing cleanup, like she's got two Shinra soldiers that she's beating the shit out of, and now she's just walking away with them. Because I mean, Tifa is super strong when you look at her and what she like does actually in game. So I thought it'd be super cool to have her almost in this like just physically not strong, like from a she can hit and kick hard, but like she's just fucking strong. So I had this idea of her with like one Shinra Soldier over her shoulder. Wow, that was a lot of SH sounds to get through. And then with her other hand, she's just like lifting one up by his uniform. And so that's what you see the basis of here. I still wanted her to be fairly athletic looking and not super bulky, similar to the way like how we always portray Spider-Man, right? Like he's really thin, but he's actually super strong. So that's what that was right there. It blipped away for a second, but you could see it right before it left. One on her shoulder and then holding the other one. So there was something about that I was like, I don't really know if I even like that. So let's keep going. Now we're going into more of like a jumping into action pose. We don't have to anchor her into any particular thing. So if I want to come up with a different background later, I can. If I want to add something like Shinra guns poking up from the bottom or shots being fired, or I could even put tentacles like it's from Genova or something. I mean, you could do like a lot of things with that because she's just sort of dead center in the piece, and then you can frame it however you want, kind of. I also wanted on this version to push a different head height for her than normal, so I wanted her to look like she was taller and a little, not really lanky because she's still muscular, but just sort of taller, like go with that type of a body proportion, because I thought that could be fun to do with her. And you'll see in a second, of course, I abandoned it, but I did take this one somewhat far. I took it all the way to where I was starting to tighten up the anatomy and starting to tighten up the expression and all of that. One thing I want to call out, especially while we're looking at the expression on her face here, is I was going fairly either serious or conservative through a lot of these ideas. And I'll be honest, like they were never clicking at all. I actually did these roughs a while before I ended up finally actually executing on the piece. I did them over the course of, like, let's say a week, and I would sort of open up the file, doodle a bit, and then be like, nah, and put it away and go to something else. And that was the method by which I was trying to see if I could arrive at any type of an idea that I thought was strong enough for Tifa. I mean, as you can see here, this doesn't really even look that much like Tifa. That's not the point at this stage. I'm just trying to figure out the pose, but I'm also trying to figure out, like, how stylized do I want the anatomy? What kind of anatomical stylization do I really want to go with? So this is really just exploring that. And then you can see here, I start to tighten up the face. That's when I'm saying to myself, okay, let's try to commit to this. And when I start to commit to it, I'm like, yep, this isn't working. Let's cut this. I'm also trying to present these ideas a little bit linearly, but they really weren't that linear. I did kind of jump from rough file to rough file just to try and see what was sparking interest, and none of these really did. But I really wanted to include all of them, as I've done in past videos, just so that you can see the thought process and you can sort of see where my judgment is coming in as to what I'm going to be excited about or what I'm going to want to do. Here I was going for that sort of Tifa pose of her, like, fixing her gloves. It's like the Ryu pose, the Tifa pose. It's like a rock solid pose for any character that's got this type of a background, like, meaning being like a fighter. And I thought it was good, but I decided that it didn't really interest me. And not to mention the fact that, I mean, not that long ago, Renato did his piece, and it was in a very similar pose, but he had it with a lot of awesome dynamic stuff, and then we featured it here on the channel, and I was like, that's going to be too much if I'm just doing that very similar thing and also doing it in an inferior way. So you can see I take it to a point where I start to really see if it's got chops, and then I kill it. Here I also started considering where I wanted that actual crop to be, and that's why you see me doing the crop, and then I eventually abandoned this one as well. I think that where I end up taking her face in this is pretty good. I don't think that it's like a bad Tifa, but at this point I just really wasn't finding the version of Tifa that, like, I wanted to do. I think that especially if you don't get a shot at doing the same character a lot, where you get to really own it over time, you only sort of do like one ever maybe, or just a couple in your career, you want to make sure that it's how you want it to be. It's the one shot that you have at drawing it. I mean, I think that we all know some artists that we all really love that really only ever did, like, let's say one fan art of a character, and you remember it because it was just so good. Like, I remember when Joe Mad did, like, the villains of the Thundercats, and it was like the most gnarly thing ever, and he's not going to get to draw the Thundercats villains like a million times in a comic book, probably, at least. So when he did that, he made sure it counted, and there's countless examples of that. And I think that that's essentially what I think about. I'm not necessarily putting down a Tifa that people are going to remember until the end of time, but I at least want to be happy with it. So when I'm doing all of these sort of rote versions of her where it's like, yeah, okay, we've seen that a lot, it makes me say, okay, I don't think I really want to do that. So here I'm just trying to do one last shot of doing like a POV, like you are the Shinra Soldier about to get punched in the face, and I thought that it had some cool factor to it for sure, and I think that it still could be really valuable, but I don't think that I was in the mindset to execute it in the right way. So now the last version that I did before I settled on the version that you know is this right here. I retreated back to a more stoic pose. I wanted her to, I do really like just catching characters more in quiet moments, so I thought, okay, let's just go back to a more comfortable place, because that is going to make me a little bit more confident, and I'll start doing something that I'm into. And actually, I really like her base sketch more than where she ended up going. That just sort of like frame of her anatomy I think is good. Maybe I'll use it in the future for some other random piece. But I think that while I was in the middle of working on this, again, I wasn't finding anything special about Tifa while I was working on this. And I think that that is what ultimately made me abandon it. And this one goes further than the other ones did. I actually get into some costuming, and then I decide, okay, no, let's just move on. At this point, I want to also acknowledge that finding the proper reference for her new costume and remake was actually a bigger pain in the ass than I thought. There's like high quality footage out there, but it's filled with motion blurs and stuff, and then they released like official renders, but it's only from like her like rib cage up basically. And then there were some fan arts out there that had somewhat accurate, as far as I could tell, armor that I glanced at occasionally to figure out like her more elaborate left arm, which has more armor on it in the new version. And I tried to piece together, and ultimately what I ended up doing with the design, which isn't here, but it's in the version that I finished the piece with, is I did a bit of a combo. I did like a little bit from the remake and a little bit from original concept art and a little bit from this, a little bit from that, and I pieced together something that feels close to the remake but is different. And I think that works since I stylized her in other ways anyhow, that it feels like the right mashup of the right qualities basically. So in this version though, you can see she's sticking with that stoic pose. And everything though, to be honest, even though I think the base anatomy is pretty good, I think that it's just boring. And not even the pose. I think the pose is fine, but it's the fact that I'm not really choosing anything special to do with the character or in the way that I express her through stylization. So now here's the final stage that I took this to, where I'm doing like yet another cleanup / adjustment of her facial anatomy. And you can see that like sometimes it's for a purpose, but sometimes when I'm on like the fourth rough of something, like that's a big sign that it's not coming together. And so that's what you're seeing here, is me saying, okay, I really don't know where I want to take this. Let's clean it up one more time and see if we can discover any nice things in there while we're doing that. And unfortunately, I just didn't. And then here we are, and we abandon it. And now that we've done all of that exploration and found nothing that is really making us excited about it, I decide to go after an action pose, and I just completely loosen up. In fact, I think I even did a piece in between all of those others in this one, though I'm sorry, I don't remember which one it was. But at this point, I'm just like, you know what, let's just forget the sort of sanctity of the character and just have some fun. And that's usually what I do with characters, but for some reason I just wasn't doing that with this character. And I said, let's just loosen up and do something that'll just make people happy. So I thought about some of the older characters that I reimagined in years ago. I did a somewhat funny Goku. I've done like a funny He-Man. I did a not so much funny, but definitely a stylized Sephiroth, and just a lot of characters like that. I did a really goofy Squall way back in the day that people hated. And so I thought, okay, let's just go a route kind of like that and make it all about the sort of motion and the energy. And so that's what this is. You can see here that one of the most stylized aspects of her face, isn't even sketched in yet. At this point, I'm writing entirely the energy of the piece. I have my big action line at the beginning of her doing her big uppercut, and I've got the Shinra Soldier flying back, and right now he's just a generic body, but obviously Shinra Soldier is the best person for her to be uppercutting. And you can see that from that energy, and even her anatomy is super simplified, and she's reduced to almost as cartoonish a nature as she is in her original polygons by just really simple shapes, keeping everything very simple and about the motion. And from that point, that's what ended up feeding into the face as well. It was just like, okay, well, if everything's going to be kind of simplified and it's going to be about the impact of what's happening in the piece, then I got to just loosen up with the character's face as well. So now we're in the stage where I've got Tifa, and I'm actually kind of in love with this rough sketch, and I kind of don't want to blow it. So I'm moving over to the Shinra Soldier, and I'm trying to see if I can have fun with the Shinra Soldier first, because he's the boring character in this illustration, and sometimes I feel like with an illustration I have to eat my vegetables first, and that's like doing the least fun part of it. And I mean, that's not to say that drawing is a chore, it's just that sometimes it's like when I've got that awesome Tifa on the right, and then I've got this guy on the left that's just getting punched. I have to find opportunities for that to be super exciting. So if I focus on him first and I sort of treat him like he's the only illustration, he's the only one there, then I can have a little bit more fun with it. And that's where ideas like him getting shoved into his helmet and the spit flying out and the tooth and the really funny hand gesture because he's like just writhing in pain, and like all these little elements start coming from because I'm focusing just on him and I'm kind of forgetting about Tifa for a minute. In a second we'll jump back over to Tifa, but that's where we're at right now. We're trying to have as much fun as possible with the Shinra Soldier before we go into the sort of more exciting part of the piece. And now we're on to Tifa. The Shinra Soldier, you'll notice, while Tifa's being roughed in here, you'll notice that his other arm isn't in, and like his legs are similar to the way they are in the final piece, but I kind of hadn't exactly figured out what I wanted to do with them yet. And there'll be a point where we're sort of exploring what to do with that back hand. You can see it sort of ghosted in there, that it's like straight back and straight down to the left, but I needed to find something interesting to do with that. He also doesn't have his gun, because at this stage I didn't even know if I was going to include it, and then I was like, well, there's never really a moment in the game where the Shinra Soldiers don't have a gun, so like he's got to have the gun at some point. And I looked at the model sheet, the 2D model sheet for the Shinra Soldier from Crisis Core. That's where I got like the details for the outfit, which is, I think, similar to what they're going to do for the remake. I just found like a really clean piece of art, so I was like, let's use that since it was official art too. So now Tifa is getting her details put in. We've got her face in there, we've got the suspenders, we've got her iconic earring, we've got her iconic ponytail with the dolphin shape at the end. We're getting everything right, but then we're also looking at some of that reference to try and figure out what they're going to be doing with her in the new game. Like having the black sleeve that goes up with like almost no armor, and then the other side is all armored. Now we're throwing in like spit and sweat, energy, and I'm throwing in some black here and reducing the opacity on it just so I can feel what that's going to look like, because originally I was going to keep the background super graphic. So let's pause for a minute here and actually talk about these two stages. We've got the rough, and then we've got the slightly less rough, the super rough and the rough. I quickly just want to talk about the super rough because this is an important moment in the drawing. This is the moment where the artist who has to create the drawing is getting buy-in to finishing it. It's like you're selling yourself on the drawing. And if this part doesn't hold up or isn't exciting, then you're not really going to get anywhere. And I think that that's why a lot of people have pieces that they never finish that are sort of sitting in folders somewhere. It's because you haven't sold yourself that this thing it's worth all that energy to complete. And then the next stage is the cleaner rough, where we're actually trying to figure out some of those details, get some of the costuming right, confirm that we can transfer some of that energy from the sketch into the final illustration. So let's get back into the process now. As I said before, some of this recording didn't get captured, so we're going to do our best to try and compensate by providing some stills of some of the stages, as well as doing a file deep dive at the end. I don't think the deep dive is going to be as deep as it was for the Corey Taylor piece, because more of the video was salvaged here, but we definitely want to sort of go through that a little bit so that you can see what's happening there. We've moved into the final lines here, so I'll make sure we'll zoom in so you can see the details. And so here I'm just basically having fun. The rough is in, I'm super happy with the rough, and now I'm just trying to execute this cleanly. There are a few things throughout the rough that are, they're mostly figured out, but they're sort of just thrown in, and I am having to make some decisions while I'm in the middle of it, but it's not that bad, really. It's mostly just execution at this point. And of course also consulting my reference every now and then just to make sure that when I was in the rough I didn't make some sort of crazy decision that I need to fix later. thing that I think is particularly funny was that I really struggled getting these teeth right, and like teeth in general, I love drawing teeth, but I think that this is sort of what happens when you have a holdover from other influences. I think I mentioned it before, but I'm actually quite influenced by Rumiko Takahashi, even though she doesn't really show up obviously in a lot of the work that I do, but like an expression like this is obviously inspired by somebody like her, but because my style incorporates more details and a little bit more anatomy that's, I mean, not realistic, but closer to realism than she does, that means I'm having to reconcile things that she doesn't have to reconcile. If I'm reading like Meizani Koku and there's like a hilarious moment where Yosaku Gurai is like doing some crazy expression, a lot of that gets kind of filled in with your mind. She actually is a master of like leaving a lot of that information out, and you just sort of fill it in. But here I'm like, well, no, I'm drawing the teeth. And so that means that something that was inspired in a more simplistic way, simplistic obviously I mean in visual representation, there's a ton of genius and execution behind what she does, that means I'm having to fill in a lot more information and having to come up with new solutions. It's kind of like whenever you see somebody do like a very realistic interpretation of like a Peanuts character, or you see like a South Park character done in a realistic style. I mean, a lot of the times they're trying to embrace how creepy it is, so it's not that big of a problem. But when I think about like the Peanuts movie that they did a couple years ago that was all in 3D and looked like super cool, they had to come up with so many solutions to try and fill in those gaps. So anyways, that's what I'm having to do there. I'm having to take a general shape that's more or less a symbol and that's been inspired by someone else that just made it into my bag of tricks years ago, and it's still in there. And now I'm having to say like, okay, well, what does this actually look like? And that's where I don't think that it's bad to have symbols in your repertoire, but then trying to bridge that gap, sometimes it's fine, and other times it's like, oh shit, I do not know how to make these teeth look right in this particular setting. So that was a challenge, and that's why if you go back to that section, you see me screwing it up a lot before I actually get it to where it looks halfway decent. I should mention real quick that the details on that bracelet there are from me looking at the way she looks in the trailers, and it's kind of strange, and it's kind of like, you know, non-specific detailing, but I just tried to represent it as accurately as I could, despite the fact that I don't know the purpose of it. So hopefully that looks as on model as it can. Her suspenders are kind of an interesting topic because depending on the version you're looking for, or excuse me, looking at, they're really different. Trying to find a version of them that's like accurate or on model, or as I was saying, I was trying to kind of incorporate a few different versions together. It was kind of hard actually to find exactly what I needed. The version of her in the new one, when you actually get down to it, it's quite different. It's really different how they did her suspenders and her belt, and then she's got like this little skull and crossbones like ornament kind of on her skirt, and then her skirt has like a lot of detail in it, which I did leave out, by the way. It's like almost pleated or like split. I don't really know how to describe that, but it's just very different. And it's looking at that, and then looking at examples of her in other media, or even looking at the way she looks like in Dissidia versus the original, it's just very different. And so I tried to settle on a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and what was working and what I thought just would be cool for this. And that's how we end up at the version that you see here. Coming up, you'll see the skirt going really quickly that I decided on. I basically did the skirt from the original game, so it's just simple and black, and then I incorporated the little like tassel-y belt thing. It's not really a belt, it's more of an ornament of metal that dangles down with the skull and crossbones ornament on it. So I did a little bit of the remake and a little bit of the original for the skirt portion. And unfortunately, we had a huge pop in there because part of that was dropped. The fist and the shoe adjustment and all that stuff popped because it just wasn't in the time lapse. So I will have a clean line review at the end of this part, so you can see that just better. Okay, so now we've got the Shinra Soldier. He is no specific Shinra Soldier, so I'm not referencing any particular lore with this character, but I wanted to thoroughly draw him so that A, his anatomy would work within the helmet and the pose and all that stuff, and also then we can explore opportunities for funny stuff, and that's what we do here with the tear on his eye and the sort of just, blank stare. He's not enjoying himself very much. Getting his lips to sort of shoot up around his helmet and then have his helmet all jacked up because he's getting punched like into his helmet. You can see I threw in the tooth there. By the way, these are all roughs right now, and now I'll move into the clean lines. I just needed to clean it up one more time before I actually went in there and figured it out. You can see his little tooth is like up there, but I thought it'd be kind of more fun to move it to where the impact would be, like make it a little bit more central to the illustration. And now I'm doing the weird Shinra helmet that all the Shinra soldiers wear. These sort of three light eye forehead things, and then it's got this like tiered, almost pyramid type aspect, but then it's round, and it's just kind of strange actually when you actually sit and break it down. And the thing that's also kind of funny is if you go back and you look at the way Shinra soldiers looked in the original game, this actually isn't really the design of their helmet at all. It's been retconned over the years, and I tried to go, as I said at the earlier in the video, I used a model sheet from Crisis Core because that is, I believe, way closer to what they're going to be doing in Remake, and so I just used that. It's also the most recent version of the Shinra Soldier that we have in media, so I just thought it'd be a good reference point. Another thing that's sort of a symbol that I have to reconcile later in the piece is the way that I did the tear there, that sort of thing where the eye doesn't fully close and then it opens up again and encapsulates the tear that's still kind of connected to the eye. And that's great for when you're doing 2D lines, and then when you have to go in and figure it out in the actual material that you're trying to represent it as, it's tricky. And I think usually a lot just as lines. I don't think about necessarily how it will be when it makes it to the final illustration. Now luckily with this one I planned on keeping the lines the whole time, but when it came to certain materials like the spit and the water and the sweat and the tears and all that kind of crap, I had to think about it when I got to the actual coloring of it, like, okay, well, how much do I want to represent this like it's the real material? And that was not really a challenge, but more just a consideration that I had to make sure I took into account when I got to that stage. And unfortunately, the rest of the recording for the line art was dropped. I'm a little pissed about it because even the gun, I did a lot of stuff with the gun that I was hoping was going to get captured so I could talk about my methodology around it, but maybe I can do a little bit of that towards the end here when we do the deep dive on the files. For now, here is the final line so that you can see just how it ends up before I start applying a lot of color to it. And this I'm very happy with overall. I think this is a great blueprint to color it a lot of ways. I could have actually dropped the lines, I could have made them more prominent or less prominent like I did. They're still there, but they're a little underplayed. And so I'm just really happy with the way that it came out because it gave me a good field to play on, basically. You'll also notice that the canvas is slightly taller in the final lines, and when we get back into the video in a second here, it won't quite yet be like that. That was done later when I actually sent an early version of this to Renato. I was like, hey, can I get some feedback on this? And he was like, there needs to be more room at the top. Oh, there you go, you just saw it. If you go back a little bit, the canvas expanded right there. And I wanted the character to feel like he was getting sent off the screen, but it definitely felt like it was too cramped. By the way, I also want to take this moment to mention, like, we lost a lot of that flatting process in there. So you can see as it is right now, she's completely flatted, he's completely flatted. We've moved into doing some of the shadow pass, and so we will pause on these so that we can talk about them for a minute, and then I'll talk about it a lot when we get into the deep dive of the file. Okay, so let's take a minute here. This is what the flats look like. We'll do a pan across them, just so you can see what this stage looked like before the shadows got applied. The lines have been set to like a light brown, basically, and then turned to multiply. And then here's what it looks like with the shadow layer and that slight saturated rim to the shadow that you can see on the skin, basically, anywhere there's skin. Okay, let's jump back in. So a lot of stuff has happened now. This recording is fraught with missed sections, so I apologize for that. Again, we're going to have a few pieces like this where the recording is dropped, and then it gets fixed a couple pieces later. So just bear with me. I guess the positive to this is we're going to get a lot more deep dives on the actual file itself. So we've taken the puff of dust in the bottom right, we've eliminated the lines for that entirely. We've also got all the shadows laid in across the piece, as well as some of the highlights, and right now we're doing the hair highlights. That's just white set to overlay with its opacity adjusted, and then I believe I duplicated it, and oh no, I didn't duplicate and blur it. I did like a richer, more saturated outline around it. That's how I handled the shine there. Okay, now the rim light got turned back on, and the background is getting thrown in very quickly. We're just doing it with silhouettes and then blurring it and doing a bunch of just like little lighting things to make it look like there is Midgar behind it, but in more of an impressionistic way, because I don't want to distract from what's going on in the foreground. We get some little lights so that we can show like windows as well as just like decorative lights and things like that, and then throw in some atmosphere. You can see right now we've got this big strokey sort of shape in the background showing the uppercut, but it's not strong enough. That was actually another thing that Renato gave me some feedback on, was having more of a vertical motion on the entire thing, and he sent me like a quick paint over he did where he was like something like this, and it was super cool. So I was like, okay, let's try to incorporate something that's giving that vertical motion here. So I actually keep that shape in there, but it gets more and more faint as the piece goes on, and then we introduce a vertical momentum sort of streaky lines. And right now you'll see actual streaks. This is me doing a quick test, just saying like, okay, blur it, does that look cool? And then I will remove it and then do like a better version in a minute. And then we also add the streaky vertical lines that's sort of showing the, it's almost like the energy, it's motion, it's energy, it's a bunch of things, just giving that vertical thing. I mentioned way back when the back arm. You can see that the back arm has been put in. I decided to go with the version that was straight back and then just sort of in a weird way. Something that's really funny is I actually drew the thumb on the wrong side of the hand, and I was kind of excited that was going to be in the recording, and then it didn't. It wasn't, and then I had to switch it, which is funny because I like painstakingly made sure that the anatomy was all correct, and then I was like, shit, this is the wrong side. So there's tons of shit happening here, and the reason why I'm not talking about it is because it's going to be way easier to talk about it in the file deep dive. So right now there's just a lot going on, but at least you can see a little bit of how it happens as far as sequentiality goes. There's a new word for you. Just so you can see where my thought process was at this stage. And of course the vertical streak was lost in the recording. Okay, so this is the final version of the illustration. There's a lot going on, and I'm not happy that a lot of it didn't get captured in the recording. So let's jump into the file and take a look. Okay, so here we are with all of the versions of the Tifa file. Now you can see in the top left I've got Tifa 10X and Tifa 9X. Those are just duplicated files so that I can mess with those and not worry about screwing up the originals. You can see Tifa 1, 2, 3, 4. Those were the ones filled with all of the options that I did not go with. So for instance, if we jump into this one, Tifa 2, you can see here, this is the illustration I was talking about where she's got two Shinra soldiers, one just on her shoulder, the other she's holding by the uniform. And this file also has the one of her jumping right there. Super faint, but you can see it right there. So let's turn that back on. I leave that one on so I remember which file that is. So there's a bunch of reasons why I do it that way. Sometimes getting into a new file just makes my mind fresh and I'm not worried about other things that are in the file. Sometimes it's just super functional, like I go from landscape to portrait. But anyways, the point is we eventually get through Tifa 5 to Tifa 6. Actually, I should open up Tifa 6 really quick just to show you. This is the version of it that still has a couple of parts that are separate as far as the lines are concerned. So if we turn off the gun, you see the gun is on its own layer, and then there's a white blocking it, and then there's everybody else. There's a layer mask on it, apparently. Oh, I'm not using the mask yet in this piece, that's what it is. And you can see some of the roughs here. There's where I was doing the blocking for the more graphic nature of it. I was originally going to make it super graphic in the background. And then here are the final lines for Tifa and the soldier with the roughs still on in the background. So if I turn all the roughs off, there we go, you can see the resolution that I'm sort of operating at. For those of you who have mentioned like the pixelization of the fat pencil in the past, I mean, this is really what I'm dealing with too. When I zoom in on like Tifa, like you can see there is pixelization happening. Like you just can't get away from that unless you're working at really high resolutions. If I was on Photoshop, I would be working at really high resolutions, but for this, I'm just not. So if we zoom out, you can see though that it really holds up. Especially on something like Instagram where everything gets made, you know, the size super small. But there's the hand, there's the final hand that actually gets blocked by the gun a bit. So you can see both of those hands and their weird contortions because he's just freaking out while he's getting hit by this punch. And anyways, let's turn the gun back on. Let's turn the rough on first. So here's the rough that I created to start figuring out what the gun was going to look like. I looked up a bunch of reference, and then I, of course, let's create a new layer here real fast. I, of course, used the straight line tool. If you're not familiar with it, you basically just draw from one point to another. You can even do it super squiggly if you really want to. And then as long as you hold at the end, oh, well, here it does polygonal. I forgot that it has that now. So, but if you go to edit shape, I could make it, nope, I can't make it a straight line. Anyways, so if you do it in a more straight line, because I forgot about the polygonal line, if you just go whoop, like that and then hold it, it'll straighten out like that and you can do whatever you want with it. Occasionally when you go to the edit shape like there, it'll give you multiple options if it could have been one or the other. So here you can switch it to be an arc and then you can play with the arc, which is super nice actually. In fact, this is a feature that I wish was in Photoshop. It's just really good. Anyways, I did what you see here. I was just blocking out like, okay, straight line. This is roughly where the gun's going to be. And then I'm going to roughly have it be, you know, something like this. And I just basically figured out what its cube was going to be. And then I started figuring out all of the details, you know, figure out where the brakes are going to be, looking at the reference and figuring all of that out and trying to get some of the perspective correct. This gun is actually really complicated because if you see it from less of an extreme angle from the top, it's got like a barrel and then it's got like this pin that has like a rod that comes out that goes over the top of the barrel and comes down on the other side, which is kind of complex. Not the worst thing ever, but just kind of annoying. So anyways, that's how I did the gun, and you can see it was an afterthought. Whoops, I did select instead of clear. Clear. You can see that it was an afterthought because I had the characters all done, and then I was like, right, the gun. So the thing that's funny about the recording, which unfortunately we lost, is that I actually was almost done with, I think I actually completed the flatting before I realized it. So I had to come back to this line file, add in the gun, and then bring the gun into the flatted file and start flatting it. So we've got the rough, and then we've got the final lines, and then just so that I could preserve everything for now, which I think is why that mask is there, but I ended up not using it. I just painted some white in, which you can also now use as the mask if you want. You could just select that white and then come down here to that mask, and then you're going to want to select the inverse here down at the bottom, right there, and then you can, oh, I'm sorry, that would be what you do if you don't have the mask. mask. There you go. And it creates a mask so that you can block out where those lines are. In fact, I'll just go ahead and leave that in this file, that's fine. Okay, so that was me throwing in that gun later. Let's exit this piece. And let's go to Tifa 9X, because Tifa 9X I think is going to show you the most of what's actually in this file. Let's load that up. In fact, on things like Instagram and stuff, you can't even see that there's like this pattern back here to try and separate the characters even more from their background. So let's start turning a bunch of crap off, shall we? So let's turn off, 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 off. Well, let's leave the lines on. And then off. And let's turn off the background for now. And the vignetting and the dust. Okay, so that gets us basically to our flats file. You can see that on the flats, like usual, I have things like the blush for the nose. I have a couple of eye details just to make sure that those look a little bit more interesting. On the Shinra Soldier, I've got like dirt on his gloves and belt, and a little bit of dirt on his like cowl, his scarf. He has 5 o'clock shadow and some redness on his lips because he just got socked in the mouth. You can also see where the white kind of bleeds out on the eye because there's going to be the drop there. And of course we've got the tooth. The gun has a slight wood grain on it that's just really hastily thrown in because I know that it's not going to need more than that basically. And of course his boots are a little dirty too. So that's what's going on in the flats. Oh, and the earring, her earring is clear. It's basically just a white layer set to overlay because it's going to be a jewel. Depending on the version you're looking at with Tifa, that earring can kind of change. I went with the version where it's basically just crystal. Okay, now we throw on the majority of the lighting layers, which you see right here. Let's go through those individually. So we've got the flats done, and we're going to go through all of the individual elements that are lighting this character. One thing that I also want to point out is we've got a gradient here underneath her head that's pushing her hair back a little bit more, just so that we can make sure that that's separated and that we're accurately communicating that that's kind of like a darker part of the piece. So we've got flats for the individual characters that at this point have all been kind of merged into individual layers. They're not as separate as they are in earlier versions. And we need to start going through the lighting layer, which is the lighting folder, which we got right here. So let's turn these off and go through them one by one as best as possible. So we've got our shadow layer, which is a green, which is great because Final Fantasy VII's material, usually when they depict Midgar, everybody has like green shadows or maybe bluish shadows if it's like Advent Children, but green has sort of become more the thing. In the new game, of course, they're going to have more dynamic lighting, so they'll change it depending on what they want to do. But Midgar usually has a very green vibe to the entire thing. So this is a green multiply layer that looks like that. That's the ugly color that it actually is. Then we have this layer that is to sort of stylistically address some of the things that happens with lighting. It's basically just in the skin, although we'll bring it in to the hair later as well. So you see it on her and you see it on him there, and like hands. There you go. And that one's just a really rich color that's been lowered in opacity. You can see it right there. It's like bright red. So let's fix that. There we go. And then this is, if you look at the Shinra Soldier's metal, we've got a colorized bloom that's coming off of this shine. So the two of those together, by the way, they're not super hot. They could be way hotter, but we don't want that to be too distracting. But we want to communicate that that's metal. Now here's the bounce layer. This is where it's just sort of about going through and looking at every individual piece and seeing if we can capture the materials and the lighting a little bit better. So here we've got a little bit of reflection in the shadow of his helmet from his shoulder pad. His shoulder pad has a little bit of the environment reflecting in it, just very soft to try and hint at it. You can see it right there. Every one of these little rivets gets a little bit of reflection from the brown around it, or the blue in the case of the bottom side of the belt buckle. Here we have Actually, let's turn this one on first. Here we have the hair shine, and then the hair shine also gets that supporting rich color there, which is a little less apparent on Tifa than it is on the, actually they're about the same as far as apparent, but if you were to view this image at full res at some point like that, you might see that, and it's a positive detail to have in there. Okay, so that's a majority of the sort of core lighting. Then we have the layer, the line layer duplicated and blurred so that we can, it's actually sort of supporting us in a bit of an ambient occlusion type way, and it's lowered in opacity. And then the regular lines are also slightly lowered in opacity, and the two of those together start creating a part where when they overlap, it's like the darkest parts, and where they don't overlap and the blur expands out, it's softening that shape a little bit. We have just one layer here that's going to add a little bit extra glow to those helmet eyes things. And then let's get into the next layer, the next folder up, which is the rim light, which the rim light's kind of interesting because I did it with the fat pencil. This piece overall has a little bit of a slick look to it, and in doing things like that, you can bring a little bit more of that handcrafted vibe into it, and that's really important, at least to me. I mean, it's not maybe that important to everyone, but I don't know, it just is to me. And then I duplicated that and made it a rich green and blurred it underneath, and that's where we get the sort of more bloomy aspect of the rim light, and that also influences the color of it. It makes it just feel like this hot green light is hitting them, and it's helping to define that side of their silhouette. And lastly, we have this vignetting happening. If I take this vignette to 100% and then I turn off that layer mask, you can see that it's basically just a green fill. Actually, let's make it normal too. And you can see it's basically the same color as that background layer, just a little bit darker. And by setting that to multiply, and here let's also change the, there we go, blend mode, multiply, and there we go. That's taking it down to its opacity and having that vignette part where we're actually erasing away, the mask is erasing away by their face. We're bringing that attention up to the actors in the scene and less about, like, we don't need to see Tifa's knee or the Shinra Soldier's boot as much as we need to see their expressions and the action that they're taking. Next, this folder has just a bunch of little tricks in it to help with some clarity and some materials. So we've got this layer here that pushes the Shinra Soldier's arm and other leg back a little bit into the environment by putting some atmosphere on them. Then we have this, which is just a bit of a shadow to further push that back leg back a bit, which is nice just to make sure that we're definitely separating that distance there. This is where we start getting into the spit and the sweat. So if we turn on this, you can see there's the core shape that is going to be the foundation for the spit and the sweat and the tear on his face. And then here we have that haloing that I talked about in the last video and previous videos, where we're essentially filling the opposite of that shape and blurring it so that it encroaches in on the shape, and then we're clearing all that extra stuff so that way we get this even haloing around the entire thing. Then we turn this on. This gives us some of our bounce. You can see it there. Wait, wrong layer. Right there. Turning on and off. And we're doing it all around the piece to just make sure that we're adding a little bit of the material, the reflectiveness of that material all around. And then here is the hard shine. This hard shine gets placed basically anywhere you want it to be, where you want it to be really intense. So it's on the eyeball, it's on all of this like liquid that's flying through the air, it's on Tifa's eyeball, the spit coming out of her mouth, and even her earring, just so we can make that really hot. And then we've duplicated it and blurred it so that that is intense. And it's also not colorized, it's just raw white, so that we're bringing all of that glossiness and that attention to those areas as much as possible. And the last folder that I'm going to talk about in this particular file is oh, actually, sorry, wrong. Background folder. So let's go to the dust that's kicking up. This is basically just flatted as if it were going to be still with the lines, and then I erased the lines and blurred it. That's how we get that. And then we get some vignetting across the entire piece. And then on the background, it's really simple, because this is a fairly simple background, because it's about these characters, not the background. We just have some gradient work going in here. And then some silhouettes for the buildings in the background. This one trying to be a little bit like the outer wall of Midgar, and this one just being random buildings and bridges and supports and stuff. Then we have these windows that were done on separate layers. I just drew them in really quick as a bright yellowy type color, duplicated, blurred, and then merged them together and lowered the opacity so that they weren't too distracting. Here is a gradient, because now we're trying to separate the characters a bit from their background. And that big graphic shape is still in there, along with this texture that you see right here that was done with the decimal brush right there. Turn that back on. There we go. Okay, now we go to that last folder here at the very top, and we've got the decimal very subtly being placed on top of his arm and his leg so that that continues to recede into the background. I didn't do it with like her hair because I wanted her to be very prominent. And then we have this gradient to knock everything, not to really knock it back, sorry, but to incorporate the characters into that same atmosphere that we're doing with that knockback. And then my signature. So now we'll jump into the last file so you can just see all of the last final touches with this one. So now we're on to the final file that we're going to review here. And first of all, the first thing you may notice from the last piece, maybe not, there's something kind of different from it, that's the background. The base gradient that I used here is actually just flipped vertically. If I flip it back again, this is what it looked like in the previous document. By flipping it, I'm actually bringing the attention of the light where it's supposed to be, not the attention of the light, sorry, I'm bringing the source of the light where it's supposed to be, and we're bringing some more attention to the characters, because now the darkness of the characters and the lightness of the characters is contrasting properly with the darkness and the lightness of the background, bringing some attention to them. Also, that decimal pattern is gone because I decided it was actually a little too much, and instead I go with a noise so that I can get a little bit of texture into that background, but it fits a little bit more with the vibe. Early on in the piece, I was going to do more of a decimal pattern-y type thing, and it really only ended up in the background, and then I was like, well, there's really not much point in having this anymore, so I cut it. Next is the vertical swoop. The vertical swoop here is a couple of vertical lines and a soft sort of airbrush, and this is just white with a reduced opacity, but then I've duplicated that layer and set it to overlay at 100%. It's just the exact same layer. And the reason why I did that is because the white layer just by itself is there, and that's going to make sense in a second, but it's just white, so it's got no color. There's not much visual coolness to that. The overlay is not so much there, but it's starting to pull a lot of that color from the background. By having them both on at the same time with their opacities adjusted in the right way, you can see that we're bringing some of that there-ness, meaning that it's actually apparent that there's some sort of a stroke that's happening there, like a vertical energy is being transferred, but it's pulling some of that color as well. So we're not getting too boring of color play there. Now if we jump all the way up to the top here, we've got another one on top, right there, which is different streaks doing different things. And then we have a duplicate again. And what we have here is a normal that's lowered really low in opacity, because in this case now, we want the streaks to be a little bit more intense so that we can show them, but we don't want them to cover up the character too much. So it's lowered in opacity, but they're more defined. And then we've got an overlay that's also a little bit reduced in opacity that's doing the exact same thing as the other one. Thing is, we actually have more changes that we need to do with it. When we merge all of this stuff into a new layer, we get the streaks. This is where I'm using the turpentine brush as a smudge and I'm literally just that. I'm just stroking it like that, and it's getting smeared in the direction that I want it to. Then down here, we're doing the same thing on the boot and the hair. We're doing it on the Shinra Soldier's legs as he's flying up, and a few other things like the fist and his helmet and face, right? And that's all fine, but the problem is that streak in the middle is still just kind of intense and distracting. So what I did was I took this right here, this version of all the layers, so there's no streaking going on, and it only has the background vertical streaks from the punch, and merge those into a layer, and that's what we've got right here on top. So when I toggle this on and off, you see that all those streaks, all streaks, the blurring and the streaking and the blurring and the streak, it's all turned off, and we've only got the background streaks. And then I use a mask to basically mask out everything, except I let some of that foreground streak come in. And that way, we just have less of an intense streaking happening, where it's getting a little too bright white, it's getting a little too distracting, and it's obscuring things. We just knock it back. And last but not least, so that this color doesn't become too boring, we add a little bit of yellow in there through an overlay that looks like that, which by the way also has a little bit of rim action happening there. That was to just to separate the fist a little bit, which is mostly unseeable unless you view it at like the right resolution. So anyways, I hope that that was enjoyable, or at least informational. This is now the second time that I've recorded this sequence, and I recorded one of the other sequences twice because the recording kept quitting on me. So my hopes are that the technical difficulties will start decreasing in the future. For all I know, I'm gonna stop saying this and I'm gonna go check and the recording's already failed on me. Let's hope that's not the case. But anyways, I hope it was valuable, because at the very least, all these recordings dropping, you guys get to see a deep dive into the Procreate files, and I hope that's fun or informational or whatever. I hope you enjoy it. So here are the stages. You can see really quickly it's just a time lapse. This is like every individual image that I saved out when I was working on the piece. I hope you enjoyed all of the breakdown of this one. There's quite a bit of work to try and sort of do the archaeology to extract out what happened during it, since the time lapse didn't capture everything. But I hope that this was a worthwhile substitute since we didn't get that time lapse. That's the final piece. One more time, you can see it clearly right there. It was super fun to work on, and I love this character, I love this game, and I was just happy that I actually pulled out something that I was proud of, since it was getting a little hairy during the ideation part of this one. So thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting like, hitting subscribe, and I will see you on the next one. And if you're looking for me on the internet, these are the places where you can find me.